Greetings Keyforgers and welcome back. Today we're going to look at one of my best Dark Tidings decks. We have Wolf, Quaglagoon's Mastermind, Untamed, Unfathomable and Logos. Very nice purple arc on there. Almost like a ship. Bottom card coming out, Tide card coming out, turning over. We are starting out with Logos. We have Theory or Conjecture, it's an action, and when you play it you choose one. Archive the top two cards of your deck or play the top card of your deck. A second Theory or Conjecture. Science is an action. Play for the remainder of the turn. After you play another action card, gain 1 amber. Phase Shift is another action. Play, you may play a non-Logos card this turn. Old Egad, 1 power, 2 armor, destroyed, ward each of Old Egad's neighbours. Infomorph, 4 power, it put 2 draw enhancements in the deck. Eddie, 3 power, play, archive a card. Your opponent's keys cost +1 amber for each card in your archives. A second Eddie. And a third Eddie. Armor Drone, 1 power, 3 armor, fight, steal 1 amber. Forgive or Forget is an action. Play, choose one. Archive 2 cards of different types from your discard pile, or purge up to 2 cards from each discard pile. Data Forge is an action. You get an amber when you play it. Play, you may forge a key at +10 current cost, reduced by 1 for each card in your hand. And on to Unfathomable. We have Recusals Chant. It's an action. You get an amber when you play it. Play, exhaust a creature. If the tide is high, exhaust each creature instead. A second Recusals Chant. Photic Raider, 2 power. Play, capture 2 amber. While the tide is high, Photic Raider gets +4 power. Frigorific Rod is an artifact. You get an amber when you play it. Action, exhaust a creature or artifact. Call of the Void is an action. You get an amber when you play it. Play, exhaust a creature. If it was already exhausted, destroy it instead and its controller loses 1 amber. A second Call of the Void. Bubbles, 5 power. Play, put an enemy creature on top of its owner's deck. Valacanth, 6 power. While the tide is low, Valacanth cannot be used. Fight, reap, exhaust an enemy creature and each of its neighbours. Tidal Wave is an action. You get an amber when you play it. Play, if the tide is high, destroy a creature and each of its neighbours. Your opponent raises the tide. A second Tidal Wave. This one has an enhanced draw pip. Echo Pearl is an artifact. You get an amber when you play it. Omni ability, destroy Echo Pearl, exhaust, stun and enrage a creature. Kilogog's Trench is an artifact. At the end of your turn, place 1 depth counter on Kilogog's Trench, then destroy each creature with power equal to the number of depth counters on Kilogog's Trench. And finally on to Untamed. Myliobe, 4 power. While the tide is high, Myliobe gains Skirmish. Before fight, enrage the creature Myliobe fights and each of that creature's neighbours. Molymork, 5 power. Play, destroy an artifact. Keyfrog, 2 power. Destroyed, forge a key at current cost. Flumph, 3 power with Skirmish. Fight, give a beast creature 2 +1 power counters. Deepwater Gruan, 5 power. You get 2 amber when you play it. Play Reap, if the tide is low, your opponent gains 1 amber. A second Deepwater Gruan. Chelonia, 2 power elusive. After you play another creature, if the tide is high, gain 1 amber. A second Chelonia. This one has a draw enhancement. Assert Dominance is an action. Play, for the remainder of the turn, a friendly creature gains Skirmish, ready and fight with that creature. Spore Gorger, 4 power. Reap gives Spore Gorger a +1 power counter. You may remove each +1 power counter from Spore Gorger. For each counter removed this way, deal 1 damage to each other creature. Bumblebee, 1 power with Alpha. Play, give 2 +1 power counters to each other friendly untamed creature. Washed Away is an action. You get an amber when you play it. Play, if the tide is high, destroy each artifact, otherwise raise the tide. And there we have it. Now that's a pretty good Dark Tidings deck. Let's take a look at some of the combos in there. If we get straight into this breakdown, we had 19 creatures, 14 actions, 3 artifacts and 0 upgrades. There was 14 printed amber in the deck, and there were 2 draw enhancements. There were 3 cards that manipulated the tide outside of taking the chains on the tide card, and 12 cards in our deck that actually used the tide. If we start with amber control, you'll see it's pretty much localized to one house, but if we go with Unfathomable, we have the Photic Raider. That play effect of capture 2 amber, and it gets 6 power rather than 2 if the tide is high. We don't have any way of taking the amber off our creatures, so it is pretty much just a stall. We have 2 Call of the Void. Action cards, we get an amber when we play them, and we get to exhaust a creature. If that creature is already exhausted, we destroy it, and then the controller of that creature loses 1 amber. Now we have plenty of ways in this deck to exhaust creatures, so pulling this off, usually quite easy to do. In Logos we had an Armor Drone, 1 power, 3 armor, fight, steal and amber. And then the highlight of this deck, or one of the highlights I would say, is the 3 Eddy. 3 power, when you play you archive a card, and your opponent's keys cost +1 amber for each card in your archives. Now, given the fact that we have that Data Forge in here, we're going to want to put cards in our archives to save up for that. The longer you can keep an Eddy on the field, the better. We don't really have any steal in this deck, and the only capture was from that Photic Raider, so if you are facing a rush deck, you're going to have to outrush it. Usually, I tend to play 1 Eddy at a time if I've got them in my hand. I know you shouldn't really hold cards, but if I play all 3 and they wipe the board, then I've got to wait for my deck to cycle before I can get that through again. So if you've got 4 or 5 cards in your archives, playing 1 a turn does get that key cost up to around about 10, 11, sometimes 12, depending on how many cards you've got in your archives. None of that is going to contribute towards expected amber. We have the Science card in Logos, and in this deck it works quite well. I think we have around about 3 or 4 actions in Logos, so there is a ramp for us if we are able to get them into our hand. And yes, it does work quite well if you archive it and then play it whilst trying to pull off a Data Forge. If you do pull off a Data Forge, you can then play Science and play all the cards in your hand to build up your pool to maybe put yourself on check at the end of your turn. But the other 2 cards for expected amber were in Untamed, and we had those 2 Chelonia. 2 power with elusive, one of them hit that draw pip, but if the tide is high, every time we play a creature, we gain 1 amber. Having them both out on the board is great, because that's 2 amber per creature. We do have 19 creatures in the deck. They are elusive, so they do survive a little bit longer, but for a 2 powered creature, enhancements and low level direct damage can take them off pretty easily. And then we had the 2 Deepwater Gruin. Now these do have 2 amber pips each. They are absolutely immense, because if you play 1 with 2 Chelonia down, that's 4 amber. If the tide's low, you give your opponent an amber, but more often than not, you're going to want the tide high, because otherwise Chelonia will not activate. So that's the majority of our expected amber. It's that spike, and again, we can use our archives for that. And we do have that key cheat in Untamed as well, of that Key Frog, which we can easily take out on our own turn. Artifact control, we did have it. Washed away. Action, amber when you play it, and when you play it, if the tide is high, you destroy each artifact, or you raise the tide. So it's one of our tide manipulation cards for free without having to take these chains here. We had the Mollymork, 5 power creature in Untamed with the play effect of destroy an artifact. Now that's a must. There's no you may in there, so if you're the only one with an artifact, you will be destroying your own artifact. I think we've got about 3 in this deck. There aren't that many. In fact, I probably sacrificed them plenty of times each because they're not integral to anything. Maybe the Kilogrog's Trench if you're trying to set up for a Key Frog. And then we had the Frigorific Rod in Unfathomable. Artifact, and when you play it, and as an action you exhaust a creature or artifact. Now I really like the fact that it says or artifact here as well. So it does mean that you can prevent some nasty action or omni abilities from your opponent's artifacts because they will be exhausted on their turn. Creature control, not bad in this deck. And actually keeping our opponent's battle line low, one of the ways we can stall out until we can hit that spike in our amber on that Untamed turn. We had Flumph. Now I know it's the bane of my existence because I've lost to it many times, but it's in my deck this time, so it's not too bad. 3 power skirmish. That'll probably read after fight if it ever gets reprinted. Give a beast 2+1 power counters. Now that works really well with our Spore Gorger. 4 power reap. When you reap, you give the Spore Gorger a +1 power counter, then you can remove each +1 power counter from Spore Gorger For each counter removed this way, you deal 1 damage to each other creature. Again, a very nice way of taking out our Keyfrog. And you can kind of bolster it up if you've got Flumph in play at the same time. We have Assert Dominance. For the remainder of the turn, a friendly creature gains skirmish, ready and fight with that creature. That is an out-of-house cheat. Myliobe. While the tide is high, it gains skirmish, and then before fight, enrage the creature Myliobe fights and each of that creature's neighbours. If we're attacking into a taunt, because we want to get to those other creatures either side that have got good reap abilities and we're going to enrage them, skirmish will allow us to do that without taking damage. The Valucanth. Now this was an anomaly in Worlds Collide. Now we see it in all its glory in Unfathomable. While the tide is low, you can't use it. So it's a 6-power creature, but the tide must be high. Fight Reap, you can exhaust an enemy creature and each of its neighbours. Again, setting up for those Call of the Voids from earlier on. The Echo Pearl. Only ability on an artifact to destroy it and exhaust, stun and enrage a creature. That can just absolutely nullify a Reap ability for like 3 turns. We had Bubbles. Put an enemy creature on top of its owner's deck. We had 2 Recusals Chant. Action card of exhaust a creature. Again, ties in with our Core of the Void. If the tide is high, we exhaust each creature instead. If we have high tide, this is the last card you play on your Unfathomable turn because you will then ready and your opponent won't. Locking an opponent's battle line down of creatures because they're all exhausted can sometimes win you the game outright. Killigog's Trench, like I talked about earlier, passive ability of each turn you place a depth counter on it, and then any creatures with power equal to that depth at the end of the turn are just destroyed. Again, we're looking at that Keyfrog there. And then 2 Tidal Wave. I love this card. One of them hit that other draw enhancement, and when you play it, if the tide is high, you destroy a creature and each of its neighbours. That's 3 creatures out. Boom. Straight away, just gone. But your opponent raises the tide, so you'll either have to take chains or find another way in this deck of gaining the tide back. We did have some efficiency in the deck, and you guessed it, it came from a Logos. We had that Infomorph that put the only 2 enhancements in the deck. That was the draw. We also had Phase Shift. Logos card, again, used quite well with Science. You may play a non-Logos card this turn, so actually, that's just a straight house cheat. And then we had the 2 Theory or Conjecture. Now, I love these either or cards because they give you options, depending on your board state. You've got here, choose one. You archive the top 2 cards of your deck, or you play the top card of your deck. Most of the time you'll archive it because you're setting up for that Data Forge and to try and boost your archives up so you've got those eddies that are going to prevent your opponent from forging. In Recursion, we had Forgive or Forget, the other choose option card, to archive 2 cards of different types from your discard pile. So it's 2 cards, one of either creature, action, artifact or upgrade, and then one of the other, but you can't do 2 the same. Or you can purge up to 2 cards from each discard pile. Now that does say that each discard pile there, so you will be purging your own. There are a few cards we wouldn't mind purging, but most of the time the cards in this deck synergize pretty well. We had our 2 key cheats, like I said, the Keyfrog and the Data Forge. I have managed to put off both in a game before, and the only other 2 cards that were in the deck were the Bumblebird, the Alpha, 1 power, give 2+1 power counters to each other friendly untamed creature. Again, quite good with that Spore Gorger. And then we had the Old Egad. 1 power, 2 armor destroyed, ward each of Old Egad's neighbours. Quite good if you can put it in between a couple of eddies and then take it out yourself. Our only real ball clear was that Killigog's Trench, but it's not really a ball clear because once you get around about above 6 on there, it's going up. There aren't that many creatures that are going to have an effect on the board when you get higher than probably about 10, unless your opponent is pumping them up or they've got a gigantic creature. But again, it's going to take 20 turns to get up there. Most Keyforge games are done by then. I like the deck. It does rely heavily on that archive, not only for the amber control of your opponent, but also for that spike you're going to get for your Untamed, and to put off that Data Forge. The Keyfrog we are able to take out pretty well ourselves. A Recusal's Chant and Call of the Void, even on an Unfathomable turn, as long as it's on the board, we can take it out. If you're interested in the SAS score, it was an 81. It was a base of 66, so there is a lot of synergy which I've gone through here today. They consider it in the top 99% of decks. I've played it. It is one of the better Dark Tidings decks I've played. I'm really interested to see the other cards that we haven't explored yet in Winds of Exchange for Unfathomable, because the tide is removed. So Are they going to take the place of Dis, or are they going to have some other kind of interaction with KeyForge? I don't know. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to take it for a spin on the Crucible. All that remains for me to say is good luck, have fun, keep forging.